The Art of Leadership Network.
Hey leaders, welcome to the Lead Culture Podcast. We're part of the Art of Leadership Network. I'm your host, Jenni Catron, CEO of the Foresight Group. We're a company dedicated to helping leaders develop thriving teams. Each week, I'll be your guide as we explore practical strategies to equip you with the tools you need to lead with clarity, confidence, and build unstoppable momentum in your organization. My mission is to be your trusted coach, empowering you to master the art of self-leadership so you'll learn to lead yourself well so you can lead others better. Each week, we take a deep dive on a leadership or a culture topic. You'll hear stories from amazing guests and leaders like you who are committed to leading well. So let's dive in and keep learning on this leadership journey together. We are picking up kind of a part 2 discussion on a subject we started last week, talking about organizational charts that work. How do you design an org chart that aligns, empowers, and unlocks your team? And last week, I gave you a lot of insights on why I believe organizational charts matter, what you need to be thinking about, whether your org chart is as clear as you think it is or not. And this week, I want to dive into a little bit more of the how. How do you actually build it, reevaluate it, design it, et cetera? So we're going to get into that today because we got a ton of great feedback from last week's episode. And I honestly believe this is one of the key things great leaders are looking at right now, is they're saying, how do I align my team to achieve the mission? Last week, I told you that there are 2 really good reasons why org charts should energize you, why you should care about organizational charts. And the first is that a great org chart reflects the sacred privilege that we have as leaders to steward the resources of the people that God has entrusted to us. And then secondly, a well-designed org chart empowers us to accomplish the mission of the organization. See, I believe that as a leader, you have 2 really key responsibilities. You have a responsibility to steward the individuals that God has brought to your organization in this season, the people that He has entrusted to your care. They have gifts, they have talents, they have experiences, they are growing, they are developing, and you have a responsibility to steward that. And then secondly, you have a responsibility to steward the mission and the vision of the organization and be seeking to achieve that. Now, the challenge is for most of us as leaders is that we will focus on one or the other. We will focus on the achievement of the mission and pursuing strategy, sometimes to the detriment of the team. And then sometimes we focus so much on the individuals kind of catering to their needs or their wants or their whines to the detriment of actually achieving the mission. And so that is a tension that we manage as leaders and saying, I'm responsible for both. And I think a great organizational chart helps you start to manage that tension in a more effective way. So again, last week, we talked a lot about just why we need to pay attention to them, why they're so critical. And I gave you a couple symptoms of an org chart that needs clarity. We said if your org chart doesn't exist, or if it's ambiguous, or if it's incorrect, or if it's just ignored, then you need some clarity on your org chart. So if you fall into one of those categories, I'm glad you're listening today because I'm going to give you some how, because it's time to reevaluate this thing. Another thing we talked about last week was what a great org chart does. A great org chart provides clarity for our role and our place on the team for every person in the organization, by the way. We understand our role and our place on the team. Secondly, we understand our authority and our responsibility, right? We know what we're responsible for. A clear org chart helps define communication, who needs to know what and when. A clear org chart helps us understand good meeting structure. It helps us kind of give direction to our meeting structure. And a clear org chart helps us with decision making. We know who makes decisions and how. And then back to the authority piece, who needs to sign off on those decisions, et cetera. So a great clear org chart really helps us move mission forward. So today I want to tell you how. How do you reevaluate that org chart? Because this is where we get stuck, right? I talked to a number of individuals. Last week, I was at a conference and we did a session on org charts. And I could have probably talked for hours with people afterwards, just saying, okay, and there's this dynamic and there's this dynamic and we have this going on and we have this going on. So while I'm going to give you 6 steps for reevaluating your org chart, I also want to preface this by saying back to that responsibility of stewarding both the individuals that God has brought to you and the mission of the organization, you're going to feel that tension in the evaluation of your org chart. There's a lot of nuance there that I can't completely account for in these 6 steps. So I want you to listen with a discerning ear, because I do believe deeply, and this is the process that we take leaders through if we're helping you reevaluate your organizational chart. But I want you to also listen with a discerning ear. You're going to have some nuances that do need to be accounted for. At the same time, oftentimes you will let those nuances be the very thing that keeps you from making the changes you need to make. I'm going to push you a little bit to do what I say is structure for strategy. And that's going to make you a little uncomfortable. But I want you to just, wherever you feel stretched and a little uncomfortable with something that I'm suggesting, I want you to really ask yourself some good questions about it and make sure that you're not taking the easy way out by giving yourself an exception to how you structure, rather than maybe making some tougher, harder decisions about how do we structure to help us create a clear organizational chart. Okay. Hopefully that'll make even more sense as we dig into this, and I'll try to provide some clarity there. But I do just want to preface it that while I'm going to try to give you some simple steps, there is still some nuance and there's some discernment and intuition required in designing a great organizational chart. So let's look at step 1. How do you reevaluate an org chart? My conviction is that you start with what? Now, here's what I mean by that, is that I want you to structure for your strategy. Oftentimes, we as leaders will focus on the who, and we'll look at who do we have here. And we talked about this last week a little bit in that Frankenstein org chart that sometimes emerges, right? Because we just kind of take whoever's come to us and then we look at what are they best at, and we give them titles that really kind of make no sense. But, it all kind of gets done, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And honestly, it's serving the individuals rather than serving the organization. And remember, I told you there's a tension between those two, that you've got to kind of manage the tension of both. But you need to, when you're reevaluating your org chart, you need to start with what? How do we build a structure that supports our strategy? So what are we trying to accomplish? What is the strategy, mission, vision, strategy of our organization? And then when we're looking at that, it should define the core functions of your organization or your ministry. Okay. So I want you, before you even start putting boxes and lines on a piece of paper, I want you to just say, hey, what are the key 3 or 4 functions of our organization or our ministry that everything else should flow from? Okay. So you're first thinking what, not who. Okay. What are those core functions that are going to enable us to accomplish our mission? So let me give you some examples. These are not answers. These are examples, because depending on your organization, your mission, the size and stage of your organization and your mission, this could shift. But if you're a business, some of your core functions that need to be kind of at that executive level, top of the org chart, might be things like sales, marketing, and operations. May or may not be. Some of those might be cascaded under each other, but those might be some examples of core functions. Now, there's a lot more stuff going on underneath. Under sales, there might be customer service. Under marketing, there might be social media. And so there's going to be some cascading effect. But what are those top 2, 3, 4 at the most core functions that everything else flows from? If you're in a ministry, one of those areas might be like programs or ministry teams. Another one might be worship or creative arts. And you might have an administration. I often call them buckets, right? Like, what are those functions or those buckets at the top of the organization that everything spills over from? So that's what you want to do with first, is you want to start with what? What are the core functions that are necessary at the executive level of the organization to achieve our mission? And then everything's going to cascade from that. So you start there. Start with what? Secondly, you want to clarify the role of the senior leader. This is where our who's and what's get a little bit conflicted, right? because, in the first step, we're saying start with what? What does the organization need to grow? What does the organizational structure need to look like to best steward the resources and the momentum? What specific skills are needed, et cetera? So we're starting with what? Now we kind of ask a who question, because your senior leader is probably already a known and fixed position and person for that matter. Like we know who that is. Because everything has to kind of flow from the top of an organizational chart, we need to clarify the role of our senior leader. Considering the person who's in that position, what are their gifts, strengths, and priorities? What are the things that they do that they need to actually keep? Now, that's also a good question, because sometimes senior leaders are keeping things that actually need to cascade further in the organization. And we have to say, hey, while you can have some influence on that, that's not something you can hold and be managing or be responsible for day to day. And so we need to take that kind of pet project off of your actual role and job description. But we do need to understand, for those of you in ministry, a lot of your senior leaders are senior pastors, and teaching is going to be a primary function of their role. Now, if they were the CEO of an organization, that would not be a function for them. Right? You see how the strategy of the mission can inform the structure, right? In the ministry context, you're going to have a senior pastor that's going to have some teaching or care responsibilities that would not be in the most senior leadership seat of a business or, some other organization type. So clarify the role of that senior leader, the most senior leader of your organization, and analyze the gifts, strengths, and priorities for that role. So based on who's there, how does that inform what needs to happen next? So which core functions, if any, so remember you identified 3 or 4 core functions, which of those core functions actually does the senior leader still directly do? Because there might be 1 or 2 of those, especially depending on the size of your organization. And most of you listening, we're still relatively small organizations with, 25 to 100 employees is going to be my guess about where most of you kind of land. It's likely that your senior leader is going to hold some core function as part of their actual role responsibility. So you just want to get clarity on that. What's the role of the senior leader? What are those gifts, strengths, priorities, core functions that they're going to take responsibility for? Because then that's going to determine what happens next. So we get the senior leader in place. We have good clarity over what they're doing. We've determined what our core functions are. And now we need to talk about, this is number 3, we need to determine the span of care for that senior leader. So again, you're thinking about, okay, here's who your senior leader is. Here's their leadership style. Here's their capacity. Here's how they prefer to work. And now we need to determine how many direct reports can they comfortably serve. And guys, this is really important because different leaders have a different preference for span of care. And personally, I recommend no more than 4. And I honestly think that's still high for most senior leader seats. For most, it's usually 2 or 3. And for a lot, it's just 1. A lot of senior leaders want to be in that senior leader seat and have a chief of staff, or in a church context, an executive pastor. And then that person manages and leads a team. Some senior leaders are good with 2 or 3 direct reports, but that's what you need to evaluate in step 3, is knowing the role of our senior leader and then determining their span of care. How many direct reports should they have? Now, here's another rule of thumb. Your span of care should be equal to how many direct reports you can consistently meet with for a weekly one-on-one meeting. You've heard me talk about this before, but that leadership, that time to invest and develop your team is crucial to every leader at every level. So including the senior leader, who's going to have some very competent people reporting directly to him or her, they still need to be able to meet with those individuals one-on-one every week. I remember when I was stepping into a new role as in a number 2 seat, and my senior leader did not have a habit of meeting one-on-one with his direct reports. The first few weeks I was there, I was kind of fighting, and clawing for time or feedback from him because I just needed access in order to get the information I needed to do what I needed to do. It wasn't that I wasn't capable or competent. It was that in order to lead in alignment with him, I needed time with him to be able to bounce things off of him, check my instincts on things. It gave me the confidence, it gave me the clarity to then go and do what I needed to do. And so because that was lacking, I sat down with my leader and I said, listen, I need 1 hour once a week with you. I will use that time incredibly smart. I will come prepared. I will have questions. I will send you stuff ahead of time so you can be prepared, but I need dedicated time with you in order to serve you well. And so a lot of senior leaders, especially if they're high visionary, don't like doing a lot of one-on-one meetings. And so if you're the senior leader and you're listening to this, I want you to really consider, how many direct reports do I really want to give that dedicated one-on-one time with weekly in order to ensure their success? It is okay if that's only one person, but it's going to be a minimum of one, by the way. It's okay if you're like, yeah, I don't love it, I only want to have one person. That's fine. Or if you're like, no, I get energized by that. That's life-giving to me. I can do 2 or 3 and that'll be great. All good. You just have to think that through and make a very thoughtful decision on what's my span of care? How many people am I comfortable with as a direct report? If you're somebody maybe in a second chair who's trying to help reevaluate and redesign your org chart, this would be a great conversation to take to your senior leader and just say, first of all, educate them on last week's conversation about why great org charts matter and the clarity they provide for the team, because that's probably not something that they're super excited about or giving much attention to. So you need to help equip them with the understanding. And then you want to sit with them and say, hey, first, let me evaluate and help me clarify what needs to sit with you as our senior leader. And then talk about this span of care discussion. How many reports are they comfortable having, and can they, with consistency, serve and give regular one-on-one time? Because here's the thing, guys, even great leaders need access to their leader. So you could have some phenomenal people in those second chair seats. They need time with their key leader to succeed. Okay. So we're starting with what and clarifying those core functions. Secondly, we're clarifying the role of the senior leader and what are they taking responsibility for. Then we're determining the span of care for the senior leader. How many direct reports can they have? So that's now created our second tier on the org chart, right? So the first tier is senior leader. Second tier is now however many direct reports we determined that they can have. And then now number 4 is defining the functions for those direct reports. So let's pretend your senior leader said, I'd love to have 3 direct reports. That works for me. Once your direct reports are determined, roles, not specific people, we need to consider which key functions fit under these direct reports. So let's say our senior leader says, yep, 3 is great. Span of care of 3 is fantastic. I love 3 direct reports. That's great. But you defined 4 key functions back up in the first step. So now you have to look at those 4 key functions and say, you know what, can any of those be boxed together? So let's say we said our key functions are sales, marketing, operations, and programs or products. Okay. Now you have to say, can I combine any of those 2 into one of these boxes? Remember, it's going to cascade underneath them, but which ones of those 2 can I combine? And you're going to make some decisions about that based upon your organization and what feels like it would fit. Right now, guys, we're all in draft mode, right? So you're going to make some recommendations and suggestions based upon how you're thinking, but you're going to make your best educated guess at this point of, okay, which 2 could sit together? It might be that sales and marketing can sit together because for a season that works. Doesn't always work for forever, but it can work for a season. That's how we have it here at Foresight. Is sales and marketing sits in one of our buckets. And then we have operations in another bucket. And then we have our coaches and our services in another bucket. So we have 3 that report to me, and that's how that works. But you have to kind of decide what can fit together in which buckets. So number 4 is defining the key functions for those individuals that are reporting directly to the most senior leader. Now, remember, we haven't put names in those buckets yet. We've just defined functions. We're back to what. So we did what at starting with our core functions. Then we looked at who, when we were talking about the most senior leader, because we had to think about what works for them. So we're thinking a little bit of who there. Then we went to defining the span of care. So we went back to what can that senior leader oversee? How many functional roles and what sits in each of those functions? And then now we go back to who. So number 5 is evaluate your who's to determine who fits in these key functional roles. This is where some of it gets messy, right? Because now we're saying, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these individual team members who would likely sit at the executive table? My suspicion is you're reevaluating an existing org chart. So you have people already in some of these seats, and you might have already started shifting things around and it isn't clear who sits where. But evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of each individual team member. What are their gifts? Where do they shine? How are they motivated? What are their dreams and aspirations? How well do they support the vision and the direction? Do they reflect the DNA and the culture that you desire for your organization? You're going to just be thinking through all these different pieces to go, okay, now who can sit in these functional areas that we've defined report to the most senior leader? And you're going to have some obvious fits. You're going to be like, yes, this person perfectly sits in the sales and marketing role. They can totally oversee both of those areas. Or let's say, actually, you have somebody who might excel in marketing and you're going to put sales under them and you go, yep, I think they can do it, but it's going to require some training. You're doing that with some awareness of what's going to be required for them to succeed. Maybe you have somebody in the operations bucket and they've been working a little lower level, but you're like, you know what? I think that we have to pull operations up to, this executive level reporting directly to the most senior leader. And I've got somebody who has part of the skills, but I think they can learn it. I think we're going to have to do some training, but I think we can get them there. Or you may say, you know what? I think they're really great at the tech side of things, but they really can't oversee some of the other operational issues we need them to oversee. And I don't think we should elevate them into that box. And so we might actually have an open seat there that we're going to have to consider. So at this stage, you've created that second layer where the executive team is, and now you're evaluating who is on your team right now and who fits those positions that you've defined. And again, you're going to end up finding some things that feel like natural fits. And then you're going to find some things that really you're like, oh, that doesn't quite fit. And you're going to have to wrestle through some of that. You might move someone to a totally different role because the process of evaluating this who and what opened your eyes to a solution that you didn't see when you were focused maybe just on one or the other. You might also discover that some of the what's maybe aren't as critical as you first thought. I'm going to challenge you to be careful to do that, by the way, because this is where usually the heart side of our leadership causes us to just make adjustments for the people because we don't want to lose great people. Sometimes we underestimate people's capacity to grow. And so we keep them kind of in a niche and don't actually see potential that, you know what, moving them into this seat is going to make them have to learn some new skills. And we're a little afraid of having to do that work or taking the risk on them. As you evaluate this, you're going to feel that who versus what tension. This is where you're going to have to use that discerning eye to go, okay, am I catering too much to just an individual's preference and then I'm sacrificing what the organization needs? Or am I so fixated on what the organization needs that I'm not seeing potential and capacity for growth in people? So you're going to have to really wrestle that through. And it's not something that I can prescribe, here in this situation, because that's going to be unique to you. But what I want you to do is I want you to really wrestle this, that you need to start with what and define those core functions that support your strategy. You need to clarify the role of the most senior leader and what sits with them. You need to define the span of care that senior leader needs. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4 at the most direct reports? You need to define the key functions for those direct reports. What is going on in each of those boxes? And then evaluate who you have and determine who fits in those key functional roles. And then you're going to repeat the process for each of those leaders. So now you have your 3 directors, let's call them directors, that are reporting to the most senior leader. They're over these 3 key functions. And now you've determined what are the functions that cascade under them. And then you repeat the process again. So now you know the individual who's sitting there and what functional pieces are they keeping, and then what needs to cascade from them. What's their individual span of care? What do those core functions look like? And now who sits in that seat? And you keep doing that for as many layers of structure you have in your organization. That's a lot, but I hope it's starting to give you a picture of the work required to build a healthy organizational structure. You guys, I deeply believe that this can be a valuable tool. Like anything, it's a tool. And a tool used wisely is incredibly helpful. A tool used unwisely can cause a lot of damage. So again, this is where wisdom, discernment, and your instincts as a leader are really, really key. But a clearly defined organizational chart aligns, empowers, unlocks your team, allows them to see their place, have the clarity that they need to succeed in the work that they're doing to help you achieve the mission of the organization. Now, there's a whole lot more layers that we can get into in this, but I want you to do the reevaluation, walk through these steps I've defined, and then feel free to email us. Email us at podcast@getforesight.com. If we can help in any way, we would be delighted to. And if you would like to do a discovery call for us to just kind of look at your org chart and give you some feedback, we would love for you to reach out to us. Again, just podcast@getforesight.com, and we'll follow up with you. We'd love to help keep equipping you to lead well, because our heart and our passion is to cultivate healthy leaders to lead thriving team cultures. And my best hope is that we've equipped you to do that today.